Hello. We're here today talking with Keith Hébert. It is July 1st, 2021. So, welcome and thank you so much for virtually sitting down with me today. So, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, as many people know, I'm a native of Bartow County. I grew up outside of Kingston, Georgia, on U Harley Road. And when I was a kid, I really got interested in history, but very specifically the Civil War, mainly because I went to school in the old Kingston Elementary, and we used to do field trips to like the cemetery, and the bus would pass the Reynolds plantation. And then when I went to Daresville High School, we would pass Barnsley every day and stuff. And so through all that, I sort of really got interested in history. So luckily, I when I went to school, I didn't study medicine as I originally thought I was going to do. I got into history, and luckily, I kind of stuck with it. And for the last wow, it's been a while now, but for a while now, I've been a college professor. Taught at the University of West Georgia for about 6 years, and I've been at Auburn University for, it's hard to believe, but about 8 years now. And so, I teach courses in a field known as public history, which is sort of, teaching students how to do sort of public outreach, develop programs like the many programs y'all enjoy at the Bartow History Museum, prepare students to work in all kinds of different fields. So, my job most days takes me far away from the Civil War, actually. But at the end of the day, it always kind of comes back to it. So, but yeah. So, when I'm not doing a program in Bartow or somewhere, usually like this past weekend down, I do a lot of work with the National Park Service, researching very specific topics that are sort of missing from some of their park stories. So yeah, it's me in a nutshell. I live in Prattville, Alabama today. I have a son that's soon to go off to college here in a little bit, and but yeah, that's me.
Awesome. Well, that's great. All right. So, tell us. I know you did a lecture off some lesser known voices. Could you tell us a little bit about what got you interested in that topic for that particular lecture?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, the Civil War is like a lot of history. Oftentimes, most of the stories are told by sort of the very wealthy or the generals or the big sort of splashy events. I mean, there's like a million books about Abraham Lincoln and a million books about Gettysburg. It's actually a million books about the Atlanta campaign as well. Um, so one thing I really enjoyed about writing like local sort of history, like scholarly local history, but local history is to really sort of go down the rabbit holes of the sort of available records to dig out people that are sort of beneath the radar a bit in that story. And sometimes these individuals still are quite affluent. I mean, they're still pretty wealthy individuals at times, but yet there's still folks who when we include them in the history of the sort of local area, we get sort of a broader understanding of what was happening there. And Bartow, for all sorts of reasons, which are unknown to me at times, there's a lot of really good documentation in Bartow. There were a lot of people in Bartow writing letters. There were a lot of people coming through Bartow before and after the war for various reasons who wrote about the area here as well. And so it really kind of creates a pretty rich source base. And one uh, source that many people don't remember or don't use that often are the William and Lala Chun letters from there. So as I mentioned in my presentation, these letters, the two of them, he served in the Civil War for about 4 years. They wrote each other at least twice a week. There were times where she wrote him like 6 times in one week. I mean, it's just, they definitely kept the Confederate mail service busy. You can ask like, well, how do they have all that paper? Uh, I think William Chun, because he was a commissary sergeant in his unit, so it's his job to write out requisitions and all that kind of stuff. He was like a supply chain manager for his regiment. I think he had plenty of paper because of that. Because he most soldiers, if you look at their letters, they don't write that often in part because they don't have paper. And when they do write, you'll see those letters where they write this way and then they write that way and then they write crossway, and you really struggle to read it. You never see that on Chun. Chun will write a 6-page letter and it'll be front page. So he obviously had a paper, and she did too. She must have. Her father was a judge, so they probably kept a lot of stuff. But anyway, what really interests me about the Chun letters is not just the frequency of it, but sort of the lived experience of the Civil War. They were basically newlyweds. She was a new mother. She had just a like 6 to 9 month old at the time that he sort of went off into the army, and they were both educated individuals. I mean, they definitely were part of the elite of Bartow, no doubt, but they were sort of at that young up and coming age, and they were so frank with one another. I think that's because they had a very sort of companionate, sort of very passionate relationship with each other. I mean, it's very clear in these letters, and it's very clear in the after the war. I mean, this isn't something that just goes away when he comes back home. I mean, they truly did love each other, and because of that, he shares a lot with her, and she shares a lot with him that I think sometimes in Civil War letters, or just letters in general, you don't see. So what you get from her, a lot of the you kind of have to read between the lines a little bit, because she doesn't just come right out and tell you everything you want. But what you get from her letters, especially, is what's going on in Cassville and Bartow County during the war. She has a lot of commentary about how many men who are like her husband who are still home, and how many men in the local area are like avoiding conscription. Now, when she writes about it, she usually writes about it in a very sort of jealous sort of way, because she really wanted her husband to be home. I mean, she supported him going off, but she wanted to be there. But you read these letters, and she gives a pretty good sense of what's going on. She talks about the impressment that Confederate government was doing, where they came and seized goods. She talks about the anxieties of worrying about a husband, because during the Civil War it was just this constant rumor mill. The families at home always thought that their loved one had disappeared. They'd receive word of a battle. Usually it'd be like, hey, there's some great Confederate. I mean, even in some of the biggest Confederate losses, the people back home thought these were great victories at first, because that's how the rumor mill worked. Then they'd usually figure out pretty quickly after, oh, wait, we lost that one. And then there'd be that fear, when an army is in retreat, like from Gettysburg or Antietam or whatever it may be, that's usually not the time to write letters, and the mail kind of shuts down. I mean, the army is in chaos at some points. And so you have that period of anxiety, right? You're used to getting these regular sort of communication. Then all of a sudden there's a month where it goes dark. And Lila furiously at times writes, and she's trying to understand. And you kind of get into the, I'm no psychologist, but you can kind of get into the psychology. And I think for most of us today, having just gone through the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and many of us have loved ones who were deployed for quite some time in very arduous circumstances where they couldn't always communicate with us. I think many people today, certainly have lived through some of those similar kind of anxieties. Um, but yeah, there's stuff like that. And just, especially as the Atlanta campaign begins, in this massive Union Army, one of the biggest armies in American history is gathering up in Chattanooga. She's very aware of that. And Willie Chun's writing back home, initially telling her, hey, just hold on. I think we're going to be able to stick to this. And but then, about a month before Union troops start coming through the area, he writes home and he says, "I don't think we're gonna retreat all the way back to Atlanta. Kind of get out and leave." And so she, like many Bartow Countyans, becomes a refugee. And we don't have a lot of letters from that period in her life, but it really shows probably the disruptions in life that would have had. I mean, she went from frequently writing, kind of being, kind of understanding what's going on with her husband, to where the two of them, it must have been difficult for them, because they went a period of about 3 months without really knowing, where the other exactly was. And in fact, his unit, the 40th Georgia, was heavily, heavily engaged in the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain and in the Battle of Atlanta. In fact, in the Battle of Atlanta, a good portion of his unit was captured. And she would hear reports of these things, but again, she doesn't know. She doesn't really hear from her husband again until Hood is retreating out of Atlanta. And so, yeah, again, that's just one couple, and it's sort of a microcosmic sort of look at the war. But you can amplify that, right? I mean, that's their experience isn't so unique to them. It's probably a pretty common one. But they're just beautiful letters, and they're in all these different archives. You see them in Civil War books. They're cited a lot of times, but usually people don't pull William Chun and Lila Chun out. And you could write a biography about them. I mean, anyone could write a really nice biography of those two.
Oh, yeah, I really enjoyed because, like you said, you hear a lot of it from a general or like war historians, and that's a good thing to learn. But I really appreciated that it was so localized on these two people. And a lot of the places that you were talking about, I have been, I know where they
Mm-hmm.
are. So that was really neat. During all of your research, did you come across anything that you found really interesting or, anything like that you'd like to share?
Oh yeah, some of the folks have been on like Civil War tours with us. I may have heard one or two of these, but bear with me. But it's really cool what you find and discover. And in part, one of the gratifying things about doing a history of where you lived. I haven't lived in Bartow in a long time now, but where I grew up is, growing up, you hear sort of a certain mythology about things, right? I mean, locals know a lot of the history, no doubt, but they also have a lot of stories that just aren't true, or sort of been embellished greatly over the years. A couple things come to mind immediately. One of them is locally, Mark Anthony Cooper, Cooper's Furnace, the ironwork. I used to go there all the time as a kid to picnic. We did field trips there, all of that kind of stuff. And as a kid, I always heard about how he was such a leading Baptist. He's handing out Bibles and things like that, which is all true. That happened. But when I was examining the records of his company town, it's a very sprawling. Etowah was quite it was one of the few industrial villages. I live in Prattville, Alabama right now. Prattville, Alabama is an industrial town. Etowah was an industrial town. There's only like four other industrial towns in the South. I mean, but if you look at the inventory of that industrial town, the great Mark Anthony Cooper helped create the Southern Baptist Convention, has a brothel, a very large brothel staffed by Black enslaved women. That's actually a regular part of that world. So it's things like that. Sticking on that theme, it was really cool. Growing up in Kingston, you hear a lot about the hospitals there and things like that. One of the most important things that the hospital did in Kingston, though, is it was a very specialized one, at least for a little while. And what it was it was a place where Confederate soldiers who suffered from venereal disease, were placed and sort of treated. And you're like, what's going on there? And when I found that out, I was like, oh, that's interesting. But then, okay, when the Confederate Army is in Dalton, Georgia, during the winter of 63, 64, right before the Atlanta campaign, when I was looking through the governor of Georgia's records, Joseph E. Brown is getting complaints like weekly from General Joe Johnson up in Dalton, and one of the biggest complaints is that these women of ill repute in Bartow County are spreading disease among his soldiers. These prostitutes basically. And one of the most interesting stories I found and discovered was, okay, so Johnson's saying, hey, there's this place on the Etowah River that we got to get, we're not the civil authorities here. We're the military authorities. You've got to go deal with these women. You got to evict them. They're killing more soldiers or disabling more soldiers than the Union is at the moment. And Joe Brown saying, well, there's not much I can do. I've got bigger things to worry about. So the Confederate Army actually goes down. You can imagine, crossing the bridge over by Etowah on the, by the Mark Anthony Cooper area on the Etowah River. And imagine sitting off on the bank of that river, a brothel, a whorehouse, basically. And so the Confederate Army came in, and there's a report of this. They actually had to file a report. They chained the thing up and they drug that building down into the Etowah River. And then they evicted the women. They took them all the way to the Union lines, which was basically Tunnel Hill, and said, you keep marching north, you keep going there. And the weird thing is, okay, so all of that's kind of, titillating kind of stuff. Eventually I connected back to something else I found. If you look in the 1860 US Census for for Cass County, you're going to find a couple weird entries in there. For example, there's one entry in there that next to occupation, you're going to have to excuse my language, but this is what it says. Next to it, it says son of a bitch and vagabond and whore. Okay. There's a group of like three families that are got, the Goldsmith, who was the sheriff who was writing out this, felt passionately enough about these people's bad reputation that he labels them a vagabond. I mean, a vagabond is like one of the worst things you could be called in that period. Well, when I found all those, that one story about what the Confederate Army is doing, I remember, I was like, wait a second, I remember seeing that. And I did the research, and it was those people. I mean, those were the ones that he evicted. So, some of this, okay, so you say, well, who cares? Well, again, the reason that place was there was because Etowah, a factory town, was right there, and that was their business, they were sort of serving. So, those are things that I always like to bring up because, again, it sort of dirties, obviously, the local history a bit, but also shows that these sources are connected to each other in ways that are kind of surprising, right? And, there's a little known person, right, in Bartow history that for about a month of the Civil War, she was the biggest thorn in the side of a general. I mean, a general sitting there trying to plan all of this campaign strategy, and he's worried about the spread of gonorrhea or something from this lady. So he goes out of his way to kind of evict her. Yeah. So there's stuff like that, and there's so many stories like that in Bartow County. They're full of sort of surprise. You just have to kind of pull up in the records and dig in a little bit, I guess.
Wow. You would not find words like that on a government, hopefully on a government document today. Oh my gosh. That's
Yeah,
definitely interesting.
it's a weird entry. Like I was literally going through the census, identifying every single farm. I mean, I have a database of like basically all the farmers in Bartow, and I'm trying to figure out. There were tenant farmers even during the antebellum period. So I was trying to figure out how many tenant farmers there are. So that means you have to go through every single one. And I'm going through there, and all of a sudden I look, because I'm always reading the occupation, I'll say farmer, laborer, something like that. I look over there, I'm like vagabond and whore, and I'm like, what's going on here? And at the time, I just kind of saved it and put it to the side. But then when I found those Brown records, I was like, holy cow, this is who they're talking about. This is, yeah. So yeah, those are sort of, not something you probably want to put on your Chamber of Commerce brochure or anything like that. But but again, it really adds, I mean, to the sort of realities of what was going on during the war. I mean, the war, sometimes the Confederate soldiers are sort of treated as like sort of knightly figures and, chivalrous and sort of without repute. You can't, but they were soldiers like soldiers in every other army in, world history and so forth. And, you had incidents like these in there.
Definitely. Well, um, I did also want to mention that um, apart from doing the lecture, you've also written a book recently called Cornerstone of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens and the Speech That Defined the Lost Cause. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and some of the research that went into all of that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's my latest book, and it just came out a couple months ago or so. And yeah, so in the so in March of 1861, Alexander Stephens of Georgia, who was just elected or appointed the vice president of the Confederacy, gives a speech down in Savannah, Georgia. And the speech is known as the Cornerstone Speech. And in this speech, Stephens, who at the time is trying to rally supporters of the Confederacy in Georgia, there's a lot of people in Georgia who aren't exactly sold on the future of the Confederate nation. There's a lot of people in the South who aren't sold. I mean, Georgia was very divided. Bartow, very divided. So in his mind as a politician, he's a very smart man. Alexander Stephens is one of the brightest people of the 19th century in many ways. He's trying to get them excited. He's trying to get them behind the cause. So he gets up in Savannah, he gives a speech where he basically lays out that, hey, folks, the real cause here, the real sort of struggle isn't a political one necessarily. It's not about taxes. It's not about tariffs. The real struggle is a struggle between the sort of white race and the black race. And that, what this war is going to ultimately determine is the future of sort of white supremacy in America, the future place of black people, and the future sort of dominance of the white race. And in fact, he lays this out in very direct sort of language. And then he even questions in this speech the validity of the Declaration of Independence, the validity of the US Constitution. He questions sort of the logic of Thomas Jefferson, the flawed logic of the founders. And it's one of the more direct speeches ever. Now you could say, well, this is just one speech, but the speech really represents the rhetoric of the day. A lot of these things were things that were discussed often in political circles. I mean, white supremacy was alive and well at the beginning of the American Civil War. But most politicians didn't come out and make such direct, explicit statements. Stevens did in part because he was very confident that this would rally people to the Confederate government. And in fact, he even lays out in the speech that the Confederacy's goal is not just independence. I mean, that's one thing, but also sort of global expansion. He really envisioned a world where the world's countries would come to the Confederacy's aid, not because of their cotton, but because of the Confederacy had built a foundation on white supremacy. And he thought this would be very appealing to the nations of the world. And then the nations of the world would step aside in the future as the Confederacy expands into, say, Central America, South America, the Caribbean, the Pacific. He had very sort of visionary sort of things. Again, he's a big picture kind of guy. But okay, so the speech gets picked up. It's definitely reflective of the kinds of conversations that were going on throughout the South during the secession crisis. If you look at Georgia's secession convention, the first paragraph of that ordinance basically talks about slavery and maintaining. Oftentimes they'll use euphemisms like maintaining Southern society, maintaining a Southern civilization. Well, what does that mean? I mean, they're talking about a lot more than just drinking mint juleps and enjoying some barbecue. They're talking about, at the end of the day, the foundation of that is that notion of sort of white supremacy. And so the book covers that part, but then it goes into sort of how we remember that speech. If you go around today, you'll see the Cornerstone speech brought up quite a bit. It's actually right now, they just voted yesterday in the US Congress to remove the Confederate statues, one of which is Alexander Stephens at the US Capitol. And yet when they were debating, they had a debate over this, guess what? One of the debaters brings out the Cornerstone speech and says, we have a statue in the Hall of American Freedom. And this is what this guy said, and he meant it. I mean, no doubt. Now he kind of tries to back away from this. So it's brought up. And the cool thing is, and this is where the research really kind of plays out, it's not just people today discovering this speech. I mean, I would argue in the last 4 or 5 years, that speech has been every bit as more important to sort of understand the war and understand American culture as like the Gettysburg Address or something like that. In fact, it's quoted about as often. I mean, you see it all over the place. But in the years after the Civil War, a lot of the former Confederates didn't want to admit that the war was what it was. And they did everything in their power through sort of the lost cause mythology to sort of bury that story and erase it. And in fact, the many former Confederates at the end will say things like, oh, Alexander Stephens was misquoted. He didn't mean what he said. You got to look at the rest of the speech, which, he lays out some other causes, but the moment of the speech is the white supremacy thing. But there was always a group of people, I call them in the book emancipationists. Some of them were Union veterans. Many of them were former slaves or Black people in America in general, who remembered this speech and often used it as a sword, basically. Whenever, when Jim Crow and racial segregation was forming, and so forth. And, there were all these Confederate memorials being built all over the country in the early 20th century. A lot of these Black leaders kind of kept a copy of that speech oftentimes in their pockets. And when they wanted to deliver a sort of rhetorical blow to the lost cause and a blow to sort of the imagined Confederate memory, they would bring out this speech and just hammer away at it. and it's everybody. I mean, it's like Hosea Williams, the great civil rights demonstrator from the 60s. He quotes the Cornerstone speech. W.B. Du Bois, one of the great Black scholars, he uses, I mean, all of these major intellectual figures in American history, kind of gravitate towards it. And meanwhile, though, the book also has chapters in there about modern, what I'd call sort of neo-Confederate groups that are really eager to celebrate the Confederacy in a way that's not really based in historical reality. I mean, it's a celebratory sort of way of sort of whitewashing over the role that slavery, the central role that slavery played in this war. And those groups, wow, I mean, this research was different for me because the last chapter involves looking at things like Reddit, YouTube, blogs, places where these groups frequent, groups like the League of the South, the Abbeville Institute. These are groups that organizations in the United States have labeled and identified as hate organizations, but they pose themselves as history providers, as sort of scholars of history. But most of that scholarship is based on a forgetful telling of the Cornerstone speech. I mean, they either ignore it or they try to say, well, the newspaper editor who wrote the speech, misquoted Stevens for, I don't know, an entire speech, just so it's known too. I mean, after the speech was delivered, in the immediate aftermath, Stevens was a celebrity in the South. I mean, they liked the speech. In fact, sometimes people will say that, Jefferson Davis got mad at him, like, how could you do this? How could you? And in fact, my research discovered that story's a myth. Davis, in fact, about 2 weeks after the Cornerstone speech, basically gave the same speech. He reaffirmed what Stevens had said. And this story about Jefferson Davis being upset with Stevens was mostly mostly fiction. It was created by a biographer of Davis 50 years later, 60 years later, as they're writing the book. So I think the point of the book is that, history is sort of malleable. There's a real difference between history and memory, how we remember something in the historical record. And that, sometimes what we see today, I think there are many people who see the type of social sort of conflicts we're in right at this moment, with Black Lives Matter and all these things. These aren't new. I mean, these didn't just rear their head, a few years ago after George Floyd and all. It's been simmering. It's constant. And at times it flares up into very visible ways, like the civil rights movement. But even after that, these things continue to simmer. And, the fact that you can find intellectuals, other people commenting about the Cornerstone speech for the past 150 years straight. I mean, it never really ends. I mean, in the 70s and 80s and 90s, there's still people wrestling with this idea. I think really speaks to sort of the longevity of sort of that social protest in America, and the fight for, I think the biggest hurdle for America is just to admit sort of and come to grips with what happened in the past so that we can move forward with something new. And, there's obviously a lot of folks that don't want to admit that. But the Cornerstone speech is hard to get away from. That's good luck, discounting that, as evidence. So, yeah, no, that was very exciting stuff. I loved writing that book. And, hopefully now I can turn to something a little more, I don't know, a little less focused on such a dark topic. But it was enjoyable to write at the time. And it is available at the Bartow History Museum. And I know in the coming months I'll come up and give a talk about the book. And,
Great. That'd be great. Yeah, we just did our Bartow book break. We do it the last work day of every month on Facebook at 12 o'clock noon. And this was the book that we talked about yesterday. And so myself and then the two other people in education sat down and got to speak about it. And we all thoroughly enjoyed it. It was very well written, very informative, but also a really good book to read. A lot of some academic books can get a bit heavy, but this one is really good. I
thank you.
really liked it.
That means a lot to me. I do try to write like to an audience of people, not just scholars and stuff. I mean, scholars we'll bore each other to death. But yeah, that book, I hate to admit this, but once I got started, it really kind of wrote itself. I mean, it really, once I started unearthing, and I think too, a thing for everyone out there to understand about this one as well, it really is a product of the digital world we live in. the tools like newspapers.com, the Hathy Trust, which is about, well, I think they just took it off, but the Hathy Trust was available to everyone. I was able to find like needles and haystacks everywhere because of these new digital tools that you couldn't have written this book like 30 years ago. It would have taken you probably your whole lifetime to track all this stuff down. But fortunately, we have all these really amazing. We live in a great time to be interested in history, even if we're at home. We live in a great time. And I wrote part of that book during the COVID stuff. I mean, I was able to keep chugging away at it. So yeah, thank you for the compliment.
Oh, sure. But yeah, if anybody watching wants a copy, you come down to the Bartow History Museum. We have hardback copies available for $40. So definitely come pick one up. And thank you so much, Keith, for sitting down and talking with me today. And I hope that we get to see you hopefully in person pretty soon.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. So
Great.
thanks,
Yeah.
everyone.